With the blocking of YouTube in Russia and pressure on other platforms, are we seeing the emergence of a digital gulag, a more efficient way to entrap and control a population, and the real world gulag of watchtowers and razor wire? Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. Please definitely at the end of this video, like it if you've enjoyed the material. Check that you're subscribed so you don't miss out on the new interviews and news content that we publish on a daily basis. Please also check out the validated Ukrainian charities that appear in the description of the video. It's incredibly important at this point, especially with aid from the EU and other allies being delayed. It's especially important to help Ukrainians to remain resilient. Today, I'm delighted to be joined for the fourth time by Ian Garner, who's an historian and analyst of Russian culture and war propaganda. He's motivated by two questions. What drives Russia's obsession with war? And why have so many Russians in the past and present fallen for militarism? Ian Garner is also a world leading authority on the myths and propaganda surrounding the Second World War Battle of Stalingrad in Soviet and Russian literature, and he's been interviewed on many, many platforms and media outlets you'd have heard of, and of course has two fantastic books out, which I highly recommend. We will put links to those and descriptions of those in this video, so please do check out the description, and if you haven't got those books, I strongly advise you to look out for them. Ian, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again, and thanks for the great introduction and for shamelessly plugging my books.
Well, they are absolutely fabulous, and especially, the Z generation one. I think it's incredibly important to be able to understand the nuances behind the emerging sort of gulag that Russia has become. I think your work and those of Jade McGlynn are absolutely essential for anybody who seeks to understand or even comment on what's going on. Well, let's touch on that idea because it really grabbed my attention in X or Twitter when you started talking about this concept of the digital gulag. What exactly do you mean by that?
This is a term that's often been used. I'm certainly not the originator of it, so I can't claim any credit, to talk about Russia as being a place where we know increasingly that physically it's hard to get in and out of the country. The Russians, and especially Russians who've been abroad for a long time, are subject to increasing controls as they come in and out of the borders. But also within the country, we're seeing a certain regression, a movement backwards in terms of digital freedoms. And when we look almost 20 years ago, for example, to when VKontakte, VK as it now is, was founded, Russia really was kind of the wild east when it came to the internet. And looking at VK in those days, it was just totally anything goes. The platform itself was a naked copy of Facebook for a start. I mean, pretty much note for note, word for word, it looked like Facebook, but it was Facebook with the doors blown off, where you could do anything. You could say pretty much anything. You could share copyrighted material. Nobody bought movies back in the mid-2000s in Russia. Nobody bought CDs. Everybody stopped doing it because you could just find everything you wanted on VK. And of course, that meant the Russians also were gathering online in spaces and were talking to each other quite openly. And one example that I can think of that actually struck me when I was talking about it was a young queer person that I was talking to when I was doing research for the Z Generation book, who said that they used to frequent LGBT forums or on VK in the mid-2000s. That was a place where, in their town and in their neighborhood, they just felt like they couldn't talk to anyone about this stuff because there was a danger associated with being queer in Russia, a physical danger. But online, you could find people like you could talk to them, you could share ideas. So there's a certain sense of not just this sort of libertarian freedom, but a sort of, an internal, a metaphysical freedom as well about the internet. And the state has increasingly placed controls on what's accessible. The list of websites that you can no longer access in Russia is through the roof. And we know about the big ones, right? We hear about limits on Instagram, Meta, and attempts at blocking Telegram in 2018, I believe it was, attempts at blocking Signal today, at slowing down YouTube. But the list is enormous, down to like stupidly trifling things. And this is the last point I'll make before you can chip in again. Even my personal website, which is, I'm just some random academic dude. I get like 300 hits on my website every month. It just lists my work and my email address if anyone wants to send me spam. That's banned in Russia. Why? Everything's banned bit by bit by bit. They're trying to carve up the internet.
Extraordinary micromanagement of the information sphere. It seems, though, that the FSB and the various tools of censorship that Russia deploys are late to the party. Would it be true to say that in the early part of Putin's sort of hybrid informational space and his hybrid autocracy, the main focus was actually on legacy media and co-opting mainstream TV? Was it a late realization for the regime how many of the younger demographic actually get their news and information from Vkontakte to start with, but also latterly Telegram?
Well, I think you're right, and they were very keen on controlling the news media early on. Putin's spin doctors, who had worked with Yeltsin in the 90s, in particular on the 1996 presidential election campaign, which, when it began, Yeltsin was expected to lose pretty handily thanks to his failing war in Chechnya, something to mull over given what's happening today in the around the fringes of Russia. And yet somehow he pulled it out the bag, mostly due to them leaning on the mainstream media. And so when Putin came in with those same spin doctors, they were pretty much battering down the doors at points, literally, of media organizations and applying all sorts of other pressure very early on to ensure that media were either friendly or were owned by friendly people, or were bought up by friendly people, indeed. And when it came to the digital stuff, there was a permissiveness across Russian political culture in the 2000s. At the top, in the upper echelons of society, in the Kremlin, absolutely, they were incredibly autocratic. They were cementing power and trying to solidify power. But broadly speaking, at this sort of micro level, the level of day-to-day life, they didn't really care very much what people were up to. Anna Politkovskaya got shot for criticizing what was happening in Chechnya. The great journalist, and if you haven't read Politkovskaya's work, you should. But other people were organizing in small groups against the war, were criticizing the war quite openly, were posting all about it on the internet. No one cared. Maybe from time to time the local police might rough you up a bit, but this wasn't anything systematic or strong. It was only really in 2010, 2011, 2012, when it wasn't the news aspects, but the organizational aspects of social media began to freak the government out. And that was in that period when we saw these huge, the Navalny protest, the early Yashin protest, Boris Nemtsov, who of course was also killed. There is a through line, a leitmotif that runs through this plot, regrettably. And most of those protests came about because young Russians in particular were organizing themselves on Facebook, where you can very quickly send an event viral when people around the country can connect. And so what we see is an organizational capacity, and also this capacity the internet has to collapse borders and collapse geographies. And that's extremely important. And I think probably, John, you're going to want to talk about a little bit about Telegram and a little bit about Telnet and influencers abroad. And this function of the internet collapsing borders is particularly important when we consider what the state is trying to achieve with its campaigns using those platforms as well today.
Well, you've sort of read my mind there, because, of course, Kontakte was developed by, the front person was Pavel Durov. The programming, interesting, I think, was actually done by his brother. So Durov is an interesting kind of, he's a kind of icon, as it were. He's almost a piece of theatre that represents it. And his brother, who I think did a lot of the hard work, we don't even know how much of the strategy, but he's very retiring, and you don't really hear about him at all. So that's kind of interesting for a start, to have this sort of flamboyant tech entrepreneur being the face of the system. But of course, he was behind Vkontakte, and the state wrested that off him, and he had to leave the country. And from that point, the Telegram emerges again, the same figure, Pavel Durov. He's pushed out of one influential platform, he creates another. The state does that coercively to start with. The big debate, of course, is around Telegram and whether it is the fully encrypted, fully free platform that is claimed of it, or whether there's some accommodation with the state. Well, that's probably jumping the gun. Let's just start with the story of how Vkontakte was taken over and co-opted by the state, and what the effect was of people posting political content on there, or even reality-based content, and how that sort of conversation has transitioned to Telegram and its influence.
Well, the short version of the story, and trying to unpick Durov's myth of what happened versus what actually happened, is very, very hard, because he's a very enigmatic figure. For somebody who's a billionaire and who is has a huge role in world media, we don't really know very much about him. But I mean, so often the case when it comes to Russia and figures working in these Russian worlds of communications and politics. Now, Durov claims that the state asked him to give up confidential information, to de-encrypt things that were happening on VK, and that he refused to do it, and as a result, he was driven out of Russia. We don't know exactly the truth of what transpired and the extent to which it was really about this de-encryption, or whether it was just the state was determined to take over another media platform. Because that had been the modus operandi, as we've already pointed out, of the Russian state since Putin took it over 13, 14 years before. That is, we want this media platform, you better give it to us, and if you don't, we're going to cook something up. We're going to cook charges up. We're going to cook problems up, and then we'll send the heavies around, whether the legal heavies, whether the physical heavies, right? So Durov may or may not have done this. We don't know. But the point is, it ended up in state hands because the state recognized it needed to control this major platform in Russia. It can't control Facebook. It can't control programs abroad, except by erecting the walls of this digital gulag and attempting to block off access to them, to young people in particular today. And so it got hold of VK, pushed Durov out, sold it to some suspiciously friendly friends of Vladimir Putin, and Durov goes off and founds Telegram, which is, if VK was Facebook with the doors blown off, then Telegram was VK to the max, where really anything goes. And I don't think I want to comment on this question of exactly the extent to which the Russian state has access or may have access, because I simply don't know. But all we can say is that the state is using Telegram in very constructive ways, in two ways, principally. Firstly, militarily. It is an important military communications tool at the front. And secondly, in terms of propaganda. It is a vital tool to propagandize, indoctrinate the population, and to disseminate friendly narratives. Whether that means the very famous war bloggers that we're talking about, and that everybody reads about, that have hundreds of thousands of followers and are pretty much the most popular channels on Telegram in Russia, and they are blogging live from the front, or whether that is simply doing a more sort of soft kind of influencing work of having influencers who are friendly, who may be paid, who may volunteer, who are sort of fellow travelers, build up networks on Telegram and share content with their followers directly. And the particularly powerful thing about Telegram in this regard, if you're trying to propagandize towards the population, is that unlike a network like Facebook or VK, or even Twitter, for example, where there is a lot of spillover between feeds, what I like and what I post affects what you see. if you're my friend, if you're in some way connected to me through this sort of rhizomatic structure of the network, right? And that's how sometimes, from time to time, for example, on Facebook, posts will pop up in your feed that's liked by, you know, your friend's uncle's brother's cousin. Well, how did it get there? There is this sort of crossover. That doesn't happen on Telegram. Everything works in these neat little feeds. And that is incredibly useful for the state because it means once they've got you in their little feed, you don't see much cross propagation of ideas that might be counter to what the state wants you to see.
Leads to a very interesting idea. It's almost a self-selecting gulag. So you accept that there's this informational chaos, there's this almost infinite glut of information. But if you can create little controlled clumps of information, then people will perhaps self-select. And then the function of the algorithm will give them more of what they want. So you can build these echo chambers even in, I would call it a free informational environment. You can still, define and build a gulag in that sense. Is that too extreme, or is that part of the process we're seeing? These little controlled clumps of sort of gulag behavior.
No, I think you're absolutely right in the sense of if you want to use the gulag metaphor, it is building the walls of your own gulag because you choose what to subscribe to. It's like a choose your own adventure war or a choose your own adventure reality. And this is why we can't talk of Russia as being a digital gulag, because some Russians will not see any of this, could live in a reality on Telegram where they are only subscribing to the most extreme anti-war content. They're only subscribing to Ukrainian groups, right? Other Russians will just be following celebrity news that, albeit most celebrity news is actually pretty political in Russia, but taking that out of the equation, you see what I mean, right? You can live in a bubble that is just the latest movies and Hollywood and pop music and all that sort of stuff. There is no politics, there is no war, it simply doesn't exist. And other Russians can live in these very aggressive environments that are full of this genocidal talk and rage and anger of the most extreme sorts of war porn and videos of destruction and torture. And all of these things coexist. All of these realities are equally real. And this is why, I'm sorry, this is a bit of a rant, but I think it's an important thing to say. When we think about understanding what Russians think, opinion polling is one of the worst ways to do it. Not because opinion polls don't tell us on average what a large group of Russians think about something. We can get a broad sense of which way the wind is blowing, albeit with some imperfections. But because opinion polls don't really reflect the way that we engage with the world anymore, and in particular in places like Russia, where media networks like Telegram, that are of this vertical, restricted, self-selecting type, are the most popular forms of social media. In fact, it's fair to say, I would not be the first scholar to say this, Telegram isn't really a social media network. It's a media distribution network, but it is not social in the sense that Facebook or Twitter or VK are.
And it has an extraordinary function, doesn't it? And I think this has touched a nerve with some Russians because there's a two-edged sword here. One, if we assume that the encryption is absolute and not hacked or backdoors provided, then it gives a platform where people who oppose Putin, I'm not going to say, necessarily fully oppose the war, but those who have various political points of view that could be considered dangerous, not just in Russia, but in Iran and many places around the world, then having an encrypted platform allows you to potentially exchange information with people you trust or a circle of people you trust. So that's on the one hand, that is an enabling feature of the process of trying to counter authoritarianism and the flow of information that that tendency towards democracy requires. On the other hand, it also provides a platform to all sorts of criminality and the authoritarians themselves. Pavel Durov seems to revel in this idea, and having looked through a lot of his utterances, he doesn't really make any distinctions between free flow of information that is law-abiding and that which is not. He doesn't really come down on those sides too much. For him, it's about this absolute libertarianism, unshackled information. But as you see in Russia, the uncertainty that provides can, lead back to a form of authoritarianism and indeed fascism at its most extremes.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's almost no point describing Elon Musk and Pavel Durov when it describes libertarianism, because it's just schoolboy sixth form takes on what it means to be a libertarianism, what freedom of speech is. And there is no doubt that on these networks, in particular Telegram, some pretty murky stuff is happening, and some pretty unpleasant people are allowed to spread information that is highly dangerous, unfettered. And while Durov will say that he is simply enabling free speech, the fact is he's also operating in many countries around the world, including in the Western world, where the things that are going on are probably illegal. And, that's clearly what the French Justice Ministry, I don't know, is it the Justice Ministry over there, or whoever takes charge of it, that's clearly what their opinion is. And we'll have to wait and see what actually happens in court and with the legal process.
And I think the last point on this, because there's a couple of other topics which I'm very keen to discuss, but there's been an outflow, quite an unusual one actually, where you have propagandists, where you have controlled Russian media, where you have mouthpieces of the regime itself and Duma members, and so-called Russian liberal opposition and diaspora, all screaming a message which is not a million miles divorced from each other. And this is perhaps one of the first issues. And I think, you could say, oh, this is all propaganda, but I think there's a lot more to it than that. Of course, I'll cut that out. And there seems to be a sense of the absolute right for various things, but absolute right in this case for expression, but with no sense of balance, responsibility, community, and in fact, no sense of the rule of law. Do you think it's interesting that we've got this cacophony of so-called Russian oppositionist liberal voices, which are very, very similar in their kind of tone and opinion on this matter with people representing the regime?
This, I think, comes from Durov's own myth of himself. Because the story that he told 10 years ago when he packed in VK and started Telegram was, I am a martyr of the Russian state. I am like you. And yet the story he also tells is one that is quite the opposite. And that is, everybody has the right to do what they want, which must, by its logical implications, mean the Russian state has the right to do what it wants and use Telegram in the ways that it wants, including to propagandize on behalf of the war, to tell lies about what's happening on the war, and to say some pretty shocking things about Ukrainians and ethnic minorities, about queer people within and around Russia. And indeed to attack the West indirectly with propaganda. And so this is an effect of this self-selecting reality. You can buy the narrative and live in the narrative you want because you can be in this bubble. And Telegram makes it easier. But what I'm surprised by is, given the extent to which Telegram is beloved, clearly, of the Russian state, and of course, the Russian state somewhat boosted, perhaps unintentionally, the oppositionists' conception of what Telegram was when it attempted to ban it or discussed banning it in 2018, 2019, and discovered that basically technologically it couldn't do it. And so it decided it was going to use it to its full capacity instead. But we live in two different realities, right? But at this point, it surprises me that the opposition members, given the ways that the state is still using Telegram in particular for military purposes, don't en masse shift to what is a much safer platform like WhatsApp, which is still easily accessible in Russia, like Signal, which we know is fully encrypted and does have some controls over what you can share and what you can do on the platform, and is much more open about the ways that it works and the ways that it protects users. It baffles me, even from the very start, that you would hitch your wagon to a platform that is based out of an autocracy in the Middle East, run by a guy that is a ultra libertarian who clearly, and I'm trying to pick my words carefully, clearly doesn't seem very interested in liberal morality and the things that the Russian opposition say that they are fighting for.
And this is pure speculation because, with a wry smile, some people have even suggested that the arrest in Paris has an interesting backstory, that actually he may be seeking protection from the French state, and there may be more to it than that. We won't know, I think, for a long time what the full story is. We may never know what the full story is. But you mentioned something interesting in your two previous answers, and this is the reliance on not just Telegram, but also various gadgets at the front to provide at least some kind of military efficiency in terms of communication and some transmission of information, training, intelligence, without which, the Russian military would have really serious problems. And yet the Duma came up with this fantastic law earlier this year to ban all gadgets from the front and to enforce it in a fairly draconian manner. Of course, the Z patriots and bloggers have kind of been going out of their mind, because that's not only a whole industry there, they also kind of recognize that it's the only way to communicate some kind of reality. When Russia fails, when its techniques fail, they understand that you need a platform to be able to communicate to other soldiers, to perhaps avoid those kind of blunders and mistakes, and provide a platform to criticize the military hierarchy. Again, that's not our perspective, but with a view to try and make their special military operation more effective. So what's your sort of take on that? And especially given your understanding of, say, Afghanistan, for instance, where such technologies were not available?
Well, firstly, I would preface this by saying I just read read an excellent book, a draft of a book that is going to come out probably later this year or maybe early next year, War in the Age of the Smartphone by Matthew Ford. And it's going to come out through Hearst. And Matthew Ford is a brilliant expert on exactly this topic. So you should have Matthew on, but you should also all buy his book, because it's going to be brilliant. And the argument Matthew makes is that war is completely wrapped up nowadays, in particular at the front in Ukraine, but also elsewhere, with the smartphone and with tech giants who have a say and have direction and have power in war like they've never done before. That war is dragging non-participants, civilians, into war ever faster because of the smartphone, because we're all connected to war in ways that Matthew will show you. And ultimately, I think, as to the Russian government's, the Duma's plan to ban gadgets and devices from the front, I mean, it's delusional. This is one of these laws that's designed to create a tabloid headline, right? It feels good, but they're not going to enforce it. It's unenforceable militarily, but also just on a morale level. Because the smartphone is essential. But also, you're right, it does allow soldiers to communicate with people behind the lines, with their families, in a way that, for example, if you go back to the war in Afghanistan, just wasn't the case. Because the war in Afghanistan really was a war that was incredibly distant for these Soviet conscripts who are mostly thrown in there against their will, and found that they might get a letter from home once a month, maybe a package with some food, which would immediately be taken away from them by the more senior conscripts, along with receiving a beating or something worse if they were unlucky. And there was really no means of making complaints. From time to time, you would get a letter through to your mother to say that, we're being treated awfully, but most of the time conscripts just didn't write that sort of stuff home. But now, of course, when we look at, for example, the invasion of Kursk, just 3 or 4 weeks ago, as soon as it happened, we started seeing live videos from the front of conscripts making phone calls, videoing each other, talking about what was happening, often with a lot of fear in their eyes, and sometimes just in this more sort of documentary way, here I am by the side of the road, which of course is stupid militarily because it's going to show the Ukrainians exactly where you are. And what is interesting about this, of course, is that it's very easy to leap on this and say, well, here they are, these terrified conscripts, aren't they useless? But don't forget, Ukraine is also playing a very clever propaganda game and psychological warfare game. And isn't it very convenient for Ukraine to flood the Russian information sphere with lots of videos of terrified and sad conscripts? So, these technologies play out in all sorts of interesting ways.
Of course, that you've got footage of the drones taking out Russian equipment, and where they can, they make those as cinematic as possible and wrap them up into entertaining packages. Now, on one level, there's a certain, I would say, obscenity with that, a gamification of war. On the other hand, it seems that Ukraine has really grasped that there's no concept anymore of a pure military campaign. Nothing can be purely tactical or military. Everything is a combined informational and military operation. And Kursk seems to have all those levels combined, including the kind of psychopolitical aspect, which is the impact that it's going to have on the Russian elite and so on. Before we turn back to information, I just wanted your quick take on Kursk and the impact of Kursk, which perhaps a lot of the sort of mainstream media are missing out on if they purely look at it as, Kursk versus Pokrovsk, for instance.
The most striking thing about the Kursk campaign in the Russian media has been the very rapid about turn that they have made. In the first few days after it began, we saw this very, if not panicked, then urgent response of claiming the whole nation is getting behind the residents of Kursk. And, we saw lots of videos of people packing up humanitarian aid, medical supplies, food, and sending them off to the front. And they may or may not have been real, but they look real enough to function as propaganda. And we saw lots of footage of columns of tanks and armored cars and helicopters flying towards Kursk. Again, real or not doesn't really matter because we're talking about narrative and propaganda. And yet, after about 5 or 6 days, it just disappeared, to the point that we had Putin yesterday mentioning Kursk for the first time in a while after somebody asked him about it. And he just basically said, no, it's just spokojno. Everything's fine. Basically, there's nothing to worry about. Don't worry. Let's just not talk about it and pretend like it doesn't happen. And here again, we see this playing out of self-selecting realities. We imagine that Russians in the information-heavy world that we live in today will simply seek out reality as it is and will focus on Kursk and ask, hold on, how is this war falling apart in so many ways? And of course, you might argue that Russia is still has the upper hand. That's okay. But, Russia is not in a good position. It's been embarrassed in a pretty big way. And yet you can live in Moscow. You can live in Chelyabinsk and Vladivostok, in Irkutsk, hundreds of miles away from the front, and none of this matters. None of it is real. Russia is still winning the war because all you see is Pokrovsk. Or maybe you don't see the war at all. And it doesn't matter. So we start to see that geography, in the sense of the experience of everybody in, to take somewhere like Irkutsk at random, the shared experience of people in Irkutsk doesn't really matter so much as the shared experience of the people who are in the same networks, who are based around Russia, or maybe even around the globe. Because once again, the internet completely collapses geography, it collapses physical boundaries.
Well, that's a good place to jump over to how the Russians use information warfare not just to coerce their own population and manage that perception of reality, but to manipulate our perception of reality. We're talking this week, and it's still, stories breaking by the minute of informational networks, influence networks in the US, and indeed probably other places will be uncovered where huge amounts of Russian money is being used to try and create an alternative reality. And it has a certain level of success there. Some people are expressing surprise. Some who've been following this over the last couple of years are not going to be surprised by this at all. And to me, it feels like this is the absolute tip of the iceberg. But what's your take on the uncovering of the Tenet influence network? And is this just a small node in what could be a very, very large system of reality distorting information?
None of this is surprising. We knew that this was happening, even if we didn't know it was happening with these particular people. Of course, we knew that they were friendly to Russia, but we didn't know who was getting paid exactly what by Russia. But it's not news in the sense that what's new about it is simply laying of charges against specific people. We've already seen other cases elsewhere of documented transfers of Russian money abroad to particular propagandists. And you can literally see people going on RT, on Russia Today, being paid to spread Russian propaganda, and then retweeting or sharing their interviews on their own social media profiles. That is effectively the same thing. It's a little bit more open than what the Tenet media crowds stand accused of doing. But the idea here, once again, is to collapse borders so that the audiences of the Tenet media influencers or those like them feel like they have more in common with Russians in Russia who share the same values. And that's why, again, we can't really talk about Russia as a digital gulag. We could talk about people erecting boundaries and choosing to become parts of certain gulags, certain pro-Russian gulags. Russia itself is not beyond a digital iron curtain.
That, of course, gets back to the choice of title of this very channel, which sort of alludes to that idea. And it's kind of interesting point you make on X that we've been buying Russian hydrocarbons, buying their oil, their gas, their minerals, their metals, and in turn, a chunk of that money, the bit that's not stolen, a big chunk of that money is being used to invest, to destroy our own pluralistic media space. And we allow this extraordinary imbalance. Russia is a partially closed and managed media space. And we have, I wouldn't call it fully open, but we have competition in our media space. This already creates an extraordinary imbalance, which unfortunately gives Russia the advantage.
It does. It's asymmetric warfare. And Russia specifically talks about its influence operations in the West as being part of a war on the West. And we have to reconceptualize our understanding of this, and we have to reconceptualize our response to this as if it were a physical attack on us, because that's the way that Russia conceives of it. And so that means, for example, and I know some people would be very uncomfortable with this, especially probably in the States, we have to rethink what freedom of speech actually means. If you are sharing Russian wartime narratives, and Russia conceives of you as a soldier in this sort of metaphysical or informational warfare, why should you be allowed to conduct warfare on behalf of an enemy power in our networks, in our digital spaces, as borderless as they are? And the answer is you shouldn't be allowed to, right? That doesn't mean blaming people for accidentally retweeting or liking or simply voicing pro-Russian propaganda, but it means if you are given money by the Russian state or you choose to take information directly from the Russian state and share it, you need to kind of front up and say, well, I'm grown up enough to understand what this means. And I think the state here and elsewhere needs to do a better job of educating people that this is not just a freedom of speech issue. This is a war issue.
And it's something that's been a little unfashionable. I've even been attacked by a couple of people for suggesting that in this sense, academia and the media are not dissimilar in that if you are providing information of any kind, then there needs to be some kind of audit trail, some sense of financial transparency, so people can look at your narratives, look at your messages, but also understand how people are earning a living, where their income comes from, and come to their own conclusion about whether those are disconnected or whether the income has some kind of influence on the narratives that are propagated. But of course, this is jealously defended by media owners. I have to say, it seems that some academics will fight this one to the death because it really impinges on their privilege as well. But it seems to me that if we're going to protect ourselves in the digital age, we have to have financial transparency and audit trails.
There's all sorts of compromises you come to, and I think I share the initial discomfort as sort of a blanket requirement to do this. But you could say, for example, you could highlight certain countries, in particular countries that are subject to sanctions, like Russia, and say if you're receiving money from Russia, then you need to declare it when you post videos, for example. There needs to be a label online to say this video has been partially funded by the Russian state. I don't think that's unreasonable to do. And to, say to Elon Musk, if you won't do that, then sorry, you can't operate X or Twitter, and the same should go for Zuckerberg and everybody else. You could say, for example, that it's over a certain value. So, if I'm making $50 from advertising, then of course it's pretty low level stuff. It's not changing too many minds. But if I'm making $100,000 per YouTube video, then it's pretty reasonable to be asking the questions, where is that kind of money coming from?
Definitely. I mean, given that the average YouTube video on, that's reaching the kind of numbers we're looking at some of these, they're talking about posts that are getting 100,000, 200,000 views. Well, they're going to be earning, they could be earning a couple of $100 from that if they were purely reliant on the normal advertising model. So, as you say, to get $100,000 for that is just, it bears no relation whatsoever to a normal media market, and questions have to be asked. And you've also pointed out that things like it's known that RT and Sputnik are not real media organizations. In some countries, they are had various sanctions and restrictions labeled on them. They're tools to game the competitive media environment. And we're starting to recognize that. Whereas someone like Tucker Carlson, who is an informational warrior, and where the sources of income for what he does are not exactly clear, no such restrictions apply, and people get extremely vociferous about limits on the freedom of expression. Though it is rather amusing to note that Tenet Media, the Kremlin-funded outlook, a network of, let's say, sort of useful idiots, felt that Carlson's stuff was too propagandistic and unsubtle for them to even handle and redistribute. But how do we tackle this extremely thorny issue of freedom versus responsibility?
I don't necessarily have a great answer on it, right? But I think the first thing to do, and this is maybe going to sound a little bit facile, the first thing to do is have an actual conversation about it, right? Where the knee-jerk response is not, you're restricting freedom of speech by talking about the limits of freedom of speech. And from my perspective, as I say, we have to understand that Russia is trying to attack us. It's trying to destabilize us. It's trying to weaponize us, to make us fight each other so that it doesn't have to do the dirty work of collapsing our governments for us. And if you don't start with a shared understanding that that is true, then you're going to struggle. But of course, the problem is, as we've established, we all live in these self-selected realities where truth is becoming inherently unstable.
And this has never been more important as it is now, because we're facing the US election coming up in November. And I'm having these sort of arguments with many people who are pro-Ukrainian, but where the whole left-right paradigm kind of instinctively kicks in something like an election. They don't like Trump. They fear what he might do for Ukraine, but they can't bring themselves to get behind Harris and so on. And it's quite a difficult one in terms of money flows, in terms of Kremlin influence. Are we able to discern whether the flow of money, because we know it goes to extremes, we know the Kremlin will fund anyone who is going to try to destroy, as you say, that the informational environment or any kind of cohesion or unity. So they will fund extremes of left, right, conspiracy theorists. They'll fund anyone who will destroy, let's say, a sort of a grown-up debate on various issues. But do we have a sense whether the bulk of that money is going to be going towards more right-wing points of view, going towards swinging a Trump victory? Or are they still looking to create chaos, which I suspect in the prior to Trump's election in 2016, the tactic was more to create informational chaos. Is it now much more directional and tied to the Ukraine war?
I mean, we don't know for sure, right? But I bet the Department of Justice, if the indictments released last week are anything to go by, has a pretty bloody good idea of what is going on. But Russia clearly has a new stake. If in 2016 and 2022, the idea was to create absolute chaos and hope that Trump won, which they're batting 1 for 2 on, so not bad going, then the strategy now seems to be more about Ukraine, because Ukraine has become, if not an existential issue for Putin, then become the central issue for Putin, simply because it's sucking up the entirety of his economy and the entirety of culture and the political center of his country. And therefore, whatever the outcome, the best outcome is one in which American support for Ukraine is fatigued, is tired, and is eventually withdrawn. And right now, it looks like the Republican Party is the best bet. So, we need only join some pretty closely located dots.
That doesn't mean, of course, they aren't in some ways angling influence on the Democrats to try to delay or confuse or prevent escalation, as it's called. But I think that's probably a topic for another conversation entirely. But this attempt to twist the narrative, to poison the digital well, as it were, we're seeing some extraordinary narratives emerging from that. And one that really grabbed my attention, which Tucker Carlson had a historian on, which she lauded as the most important voice of his generation. I'm not sure necessarily you'd share that, because he also called someone like Anna Applebaum a very bad person. But this angle is that Hitler, we've got him all wrong. He wasn't so bad after all. No, Churchill was the real bad guy. What I'm not clear on is who this appeals to and how this particular narrative would ladder up towards a Trump victory, and why these such extreme conspiratorial points of view are being invested in by Russia, because I think they clearly are. And if they're investing in them, they must think that these would provide a return of some sort.
These particular beliefs, I don't think they're particularly central to Russian propaganda, but it is all part of this very multi-layered approach in which it's not just taking one narrative, Trump is good, Democrats are bad, and expanding that. It's taking every conceivable issue that you can think of, every truth that you can think that could be demolished or shattered, and just blowing it apart. Anytime there is a fissure, they would look for it and they would try and just explode it. Even with things that are as indisputable as the events of World War II, as the immorality of Adolf Hitler, of the reality of the Holocaust. You have a few people who believe things as extreme as that, so let's blow them up, right? Let's create an issue out of it. Let's flood the playing field with real influencers, with bullshit historians, if you'll excuse my language, and with bots and trolls as well, so that nobody knows what to believe. And here, though, is the part that is often missed about Russian propaganda. You'll recognize that as this fire hose of falsehood model. You spew bullshit all over the place until nobody's sure of what's true anymore. But what happens afterwards is what's most important. Because when people's psyches are battered down by these contradictory and chaotic beliefs, what they do is go and seek out myth. They seek out very simplistic explanations of the world, which sometimes we need to do. Because, for example, we're being attacked in wartime. For example, in the Second World War, we need simple narratives and simple stories to help us cope with that sort of time. And that's okay. That's fine. But when we're talking about Holocaust narratives, if that's the narrative you latch onto, we've got a big problem. So we have to do something to stop this inflow of Russian money and direct narrative from Russia into our networks.
And it's happening at both ends of the scale, isn't it? It's happening at the sort of the lowbrow end, but it's also happening in some instances at the highbrow end as well. And you commented very interestingly on a documentary, inverted commas, that's being lauded, or I don't know if it's lauded, but certainly it's being shown at the Venice Biennale. And this is the documentary that gives another perspective on Russian soldiers. But when you trace the people involved with the project, of course, you find there are direct links to previous propaganda efforts and indeed to the understood propaganda networks. So, how do we defend at that more high end where there are a lot of people who will say, oh, it's terrible what's happening, but Russian culture, blah, 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 blah.
So I think this film is really interesting, and I should point out that I haven't seen the film, right? And most of us haven't seen the film, so maybe it's brilliant, maybe it's very subtle. I don't know. But what is rubbing people up the wrong way is, well, firstly, the director was embedded with Russian forces in occupied Ukraine, and that contravenes Ukrainian law, and Ukraine is our ally. We should therefore probably support them and recognize that this film was made with pretty heftily illegal and immoral methods, and there's some questions to be asked there, right? And just asking questions, the beloved phrase of the online rights. So I stand accused and I plead guilty. But secondly, moreover, I think it's the framing of the film, in the copy, the discussion, the synopsis of the film, which is about the humanization of these men as if their voices simply haven't been heard. And what intellectuals have to do is understand that it is not about hearing of voices, it's about critical questioning of voices. It is okay to showcase Russian voices. It is okay to talk about why Russian soldiers are doing what they're doing, but only to ask, well, why are they doing this? We don't need witness narratives in this sort of post-Holocaust style documentary as a testament to history, as a testament to what's happening about this. What we need are primary sources that we can then analyze and understand what's going on. Why do people behave like this? Can we stop them? And of course, there are obvious military means to stop them. I'm not naive, but the more we understand about the society, the better we're going to be armed going forward over the next 10, 15, 20 years to avert these sort of catastrophes that are happening in Ukraine. Rather than, red carpets and glamorous filming, because unfortunately, I'm ashamed to say, as a Canadian, some Canadian government funding as well.
Oh, that's not a good look, is it? And I think it's clever because it understands, and this really taps into a deep-seated behavior where we will potentially impose our mindset and our way of thinking on the Russians. So the classic one here, and we can hear this from many of the Russian oppositionists who are actually released, is the line, and we hear it from others who actually understand quite a lot about Russia. They'll say, well, this is Putin's war. This isn't the Russians' war, and most Russians actually don't support the war, etc. It's trying to create a narrative which almost creates a division of the leaders, the criminals from the state, and the people who are victims. They're victims in the way that Ukrainians are victims, although just for the record, Ukrainians are genuine victims here. But this is an extraordinarily powerful technique because it seeks to almost to absolve Russians from the crimes that have been committed by the state, ignoring the fact that millions of Russians are contributing to the economy, the war economy, contributing taxes, directly working in the factories. And as you pointed out earlier, we do have Z Patriot channels. We have huge media consumption in Russia, in the Russian speaking world, that consume the war as entertainment, that consume the nationalist narratives. So to say, try to absolve Russians and say that they are completely, outside of this war bubble is an extraordinarily misguided thing. But it's a very good informational technique, a very good manipulative technique, and it's one which I fear many decision makers in the West will perhaps latched onto because it's in their self-interest to rehabilitate Russia, press the button on reset when the war is actually over.
Well, I think, and even if you take out this question of the broader Russian population's complicity, which is a very morally complex topic, if you simply look at the soldiers at the front, you talked about the crimes of the state. Well, to what extent is the soldier responsible when the soldier pulls the trigger and shoots a civilian, for example, or when the soldier tortures, electrocutes, or beats a child or a woman at the front? Is it, and academics will argue about this endlessly, but I see that in popular discourse, too often it's reduced to one of two extremes. Either the extreme that you just pointed out, which is often used as this get out clause, Russians are simply empty vessels that are filled up by the power of the state. They have no agency, no ability to control what happens to them, and therefore they can't be held responsible for pulling the trigger. Or, on the other hand, the other extreme, Russians are born evil. It is an evil, bloodthirsty culture. It always has been, and therefore they are fated to kill. That's just what they do. But the problem is that explanation suffers from exactly the same problem that the first explanation does. It completely takes away individual responsibility and individual agency from the soldier. Because what we're doing is saying, well, they have no choice because that's just what they are. And so academics will look at, for example, situational theories. There is something about being at a particular time and place in a particular military unit that drives people or makes them more likely to kill. Others really strongly reject that thesis. And I'm working on this on my new book, and I don't want to give too much away, partly because I'm still working on very complex ideas, but keep your eyes peeled. And in particular, I'm trying to look at the people who are not ethnic Russians who are doing this sort of killing. For example, the killers at Bucha, many of whom were ethnic minorities themselves, and so we might imagine would sort of rail against the imperial Russian project. What drives them to be complicit in crimes like this, which only adds more levels of complexity? So if you think this is confusing for you, my brain's 24/7 on overdrive right now.
It's not just a fascinating topic, and as you say, endlessly complex. I think it's extremely important in that Western policymakers, if they come at this from a simplistic point of view, may well be complicit in the future in letting Russians, individual Russians, off the hook for the criminality that's been prosecuted. But I've got one more question, and it really links Kursk and the information manipulation around that with the actual strategy that Ukraine is trying to push here. And one of the discussions I've had on the channel is that Ukraine's strategy behind Kursk is going to be multi-layered. and it's going to be military and informational and psychological and everything. And we can see a lot of that playing out. But it seems to me one of the objectives is to push Putin to make a decision on mobilization, and in particular, mobilize the more educated, affluent urban populations that he has demonstrably tried not to touch in the 2.5 years of war, because they know that will increase potentially the fragility and tension of the Putin regime. It will create unpredictable consequences. How does this tie in with your knowledge of the Afghan war and how the pressure from the mothers of soldiers really helped to bring about the end of that conflict and partially create some sense of accountability for the regime? Is Putin extremely mindful that he has to avoid that kind of scenario at all costs? And is Kursk going to attempt to push him into a corner where he can no longer avoid it?
So I just wrote a piece on this for the New Statesman, which I suspect you might have read, and that's why you asked the question. In Afghanistan, we know that as freedoms began to be more available to the ordinary population over the course of the 10 years of the war up until 1989, soldiers' mothers groups became more and more influential in putting pressure on the government to bring the boys home. Right? Not interestingly, not influential really on prosecuting any war crimes that were happening in Afghanistan. So another interesting parallel to think about for today. And then acquired this sort of very privileged role as a result in the wars in Chechnya and dealing with lots of the issues there, including some of the crimes. Actually, they were much more proactive and much more sort of liberal about this, about making sure that conduct at the front was more in line with international humanitarian law. And today the state recognizes that this could be a problem. So what it has done is, in classic Putin style, it has flooded the playing field with fake realities, fake mothers groups who are basically named almost the same as the real mothers groups, who in turn are mostly controlled by the state now anyway, or struggle to really operate with any degree of independence. And so if you want support as a mother, you can go on VK, friendly Facebook platform, a friendly social media platform, and you can find a soldiers' mothers group. You can join in, you can ask your questions, you can feel like you're getting answers from somebody who appears to be independent, who appears to be just like you. But the answers are always veering towards, don't worry, everything's going to be okay, the state's got your back. So the state once again creates these little bubbles of community where it doesn't matter that somebody in the next department over is living in a different world where they're absolutely venting with rage and fury about the war, and they're about to go and try and march on the Kremlin because they're so angry that their son has died, because you are living in this reality where your concerns are being heard, they're being addressed by the state. Now, whether the state can continue that in perpetuity, whether it's going to be enough, is anybody's guess. But they're cognizant problem exists. So they're not naive, they're not stupid, they're inhuman, they're callous, but they know exactly what they're trying to do.
That is truly disturbing. I think it brings together a lot of things we talked about in this conversation, and indeed the previous ones, which I recommend people look at, which is the creation of a hall of mirrors, where even if you insert some level of reality, the distortion is so bad that you can no longer see which mirror is real, which isn't, which information can be trusted, which can't. It's this genuinely deserves the term Orwellian. It's terrifying. But Ian, I'm very grateful to you for helping to I would say come on and clear up some of these. In some ways, some of these issues become far more complex in understanding the nuances with you. But I think the audience always react incredibly positively to the conversations with you, and I'm very grateful that you could come on and talk about these issues.
Sure, it was a pleasure as always.